Hi, I'm Katrina from Katrina K Creations, and today I'm going to show you how to adjust your waist to hip measurement or your hip depth on your pattern. One of my blog readers has a family member she's sewing for who has a 35-inch waist and a 52-inch hip. Her question to me was, how can I get a smooth curve from the waist to the hip at the side seam on the pattern? What you're looking at now is the front pattern piece with two different hip depths. One has an 8-inch distance between the waist and the hip, and one has a 12-inch difference between the hip and the waist. Remember I said that my blog reader's pattern needed to have a 35-inch waist and a 52-inch hip measurement. The waist is significantly smaller than the hip. And when you have a situation like this, the hip depth or the distance between the waist and the hip is very important because you need room to be able to shape your side seam. I didn't put in any darts or anything because I wanted you to be able to see this clearly without any distractions. This is just for an example. The front skirt piece on the left, which I've highlighted in red, only has 8 inches between the waist and the hip. So there is no room really to shape this side seam. You definitely don't want this shape. This shape is very strange and it's not going to fit correctly. Notice the front skirt piece on the right. Now the waist is still 35 inches. The hip is still 52 inches. But if you notice, there's more room now to shape your side seam. And you don't have to worry about the fact that the pattern piece doesn't look like the average skirt pattern piece, because as plus size women, we don't have average bodies. This is why we have to make so many adjustments to our patterns, because the pattern companies make patterns for average measurements. And some of you out there may have a similar situation to this. And even if your waist is not significantly smaller than your hip, it's still good to know what your hip depth is and what the pattern hip depth is. I'm going to show you how I change the distance between the waist and the hip from 8 inches to 12 inches. But first I want to show you how to take the measurements on your pattern and also how to take the measurements on your body. When you measure your pattern piece, you want to draw in your seam allowances because you want to measure from the stitching line, not from your cutting line. You don't have to draw your stitching line all the way down your side seam, just a little past your hip line. The other thing you want to do is you want to locate your hip line on your front pattern piece. And usually they'll draw a partial line right underneath the word hip. You just want to continue that line all the way across your pattern piece from your stitching line at your side seam to your center front. Make sure your hip line is perpendicular to your center front. That's very important. Next, you want to measure your side seam between your waistline and your hip line. This will tell you how many inches your hip depth is at your side seam. The reason why I'm not telling you to do it from the center front is because some of us have waistlines that slope in the front. And so that's not going to be a good representation of what your hip depth is at your side seam. Write that number down, and on the dress form I'm going to show you how to measure your waist and your hip on your body. When you're measuring your body, I just want to give you a few tips. If you're measuring your own body, I suggest that you get some help with this. It might make it a little easier. You're going to measure your natural waist and your full hip. What you're going to do is tie a piece of elastic around your natural waist. And if you don't know where your natural waist is, tie the elastic where you think your waist is. Then bend to your left and bend to your right, and the elastic should roll in place where your natural waist is. Then you want to tie another piece of elastic around the fullest part of your hip. Fullest part of your hip is where your butt sticks out the most. That's the best way I can describe it. Once you have your elastic in place, make sure the elastic you tied around the fullest part of your hip is parallel to the floor. It should not be pointing towards the ceiling or towards the floor. The two arrows that I put in this picture is just showing you what you don't want your elastic to be doing. It should not be pointing upwards and it should not be pointing downward. It should be level around your body or parallel to the floor. And C, you want to measure the distance. Once your elastic is in place, and again, you probably will need help with this, you want to measure from the elastic at your waist to the elastic at your hip. And that will be your hip depth, or the distance between your waist and hip. Make sure you write this number down. You're going to subtract the hip depth of your pattern piece from the hip depth of your body. This will tell you how many inches you need to lower your hip line. Now I want to show you how to increase the distance between your waist and your hip. In the case of this example, I said my pattern waist to hip measurement was 8 inches and my body's waist to hip measurement was 12 inches. So I need to add 4 inches. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut my pattern piece right on my hip line. Now you should have two separate pieces. Of course, doing this on the table, you're going to need some extra paper. Tape your top pattern piece onto the paper, to your extra paper. And once you do that, you're going to measure. In my case, I'm measuring 4 inches from my hip line to get my new hip line. The line in red is my new hip line. Now tape the bottom piece of your skirt right on the new hip line, making sure that your center fronts are lined up. Now the bottom of your pattern is taped to your extra paper. You're going to fill in your center front line. Now you can reshape your side seam between your waist and your hip. Once you've done that, you can get rid of your old line. I would play around with this curve a little more. And now you can see where I've added the extra length that I needed between my waist and my hip line in red. Now what you would do is the same thing for your back pattern piece. And this is how you would adjust your waist to hip measurement or your hip depth on your pattern. If you want to see more videos like this, subscribe to my channel by clicking that bright yellow button because there's more to come. Did you like this video? I hope you did, and you can let me know by giving it a thumbs up. If you have a question or comment, leave it down below, and thanks for watching.